Hey, we're going to read chapter 8 from Toliver's Secret. I didn't want you guys to have to not hear the rest of the story, and I thought I would read chapter 8. You can just listen along, and when you're done, head on to Flipgrid so you can give me a prediction of what you think will happen after we find out about Ellen at this part. All right, so remember, Ellen got on the boat with the British soldiers. And at this point, we're trying to just let her get to Mr. Shannon's to deliver that secret bread that she's got. Okay? Ellen was so happy. She felt like shouting, here I am at last. And she could have shouted too, and had not even been heard at all, with all the noise in the little town. The cries of cannoneers, the rumbling of wagon trains, the pounding of the heavy boots of marching men filled the air of Elizabethtown. And over it all sounded the drums, the screeching fifes, and the wailing bagpipes. She skipped down the street that ran beside the waterfront. One dock after another was filled with soldiers climbing from the boats and hoisting up their knapsacks. She looked eagerly at all the signs hanging above the shops and taverns that stood against the bluff on the opposite side of the street. Nowhere could she see a sign for the Jolly Fox Tavern. Ellen was puzzled. Grandfather said it would be here and not hard to find, for Elizabeth was a small town. She began to feel anxious and decided to ask someone. Carrying her blue bundle behind her, she walked up to a big, ruddy-faced workman who had stopped his oxen by a dock and was loading his ox cart with wooden army chests. His huge muscles almost burst the sleeves of his woolen shirt. Across his fat stomach was stretched a well-worn leather apron. "Where is Mr. Shannon's tavern?" Ellen shouted above the noise of the drums and the bagpipes. "Must be here somewhere." The man's voice was as deep and rumbling as a foghorn. "It's at the sign of the Jolly Fox," Ellen shouted. "Jolly Fox Tavern?" The man wiped his hand on his shirt sleeve. "Never saw it here in Amboy." She was supposed to be in Elizabeth. "Amboy!" cried Ellen. "Isn't this Elizabethtown?" "Nay, it's Perth Amboy." The man jumped up on his cart and started to push and pull at the army chests to pile them up. Ellen stared at him, speechless. "Yes, what?" "Sure." "I'm sorry." Ellen stared at him, speechless. Higgins had said their boat was coming to Elizabethtown. "Elizabeth is back there," the man pointed with his chin, "back along the shore, about 10 miles or so." "But how can I get to Elizabeth?" Ellen cried in a high, frightened voice. "Swim, maybe," he laughed, "but walk, likely." In her alarm, Ellen felt as if her head were about to spin off her shoulders. She couldn't think, and she suddenly felt very hot. She must be in a nightmare. Grandfather had said there was only one thing to do when she got off the boat: walk to the tavern of the friendly Mr. Shannon. He hadn't said she might have to walk 10 miles in the winter when it was getting late and without knowing the way. When the man looked at her frightened face, he climbed down from his cart and bent over to her so she could hear him clearly. "Stagecoaches go to Elizabeth," he said, "if you have money to pay." Of course she had money to pay. She had the coins in her pocket. "See the big inn yonder?" he said kindly as he pointed down the street. "See the fenced-in yard beside it? The stagecoach comes there to pick up the passengers." "Oh, thank you," said Ellen gratefully. In all her life she had never been on a stagecoach. That's like a horse and buggy. But she had seen them rolling along in the streets of New York. She would climb up and get a seat on top beside the driver, and she would ask him to stop in front of the Jolly Fox Tavern so she'd have no more searching to do. As she picked her way through the crowds that filled the street, she was surprised to see so many men who looked different from the familiar redcoats. Some had short plaid skirts and bare knees, and they marched to the tune of bagpipes. Grandfather had told her they were British subjects who came from Scotland. Highlanders, he called them. But she stared in surprise at the other big men with hard faces under great heavy hats, who spoke in words she couldn't understand at all. They couldn't be British soldiers, for some wore blue coats and others green. And yet, Ellen said to herself, they have guns with bayonets and they carry knapsacks, so they must be fighting men. Carefully, she edged her way past them, looking up at their grim faces and clutching her bundle tightly. She hoped none of them would notice her. Why, she thought suddenly, they must be the Hessians. She had heard about the terrible Hessians after the battles of Long Island. Everyone at home resented the German soldiers who hired themselves to King George to fight his wars for him. They had come over here to kill colonists for money. She ducked her head and darted past them. If you remember in class, we talked about how the colonists had allies. We had France as an ally, but Britain also had allies, and the Germans, which they called the Hessians, were hired by King George to come over and fight with the British Army against the colonists, or the Continental Army. When she reached the inn, Ellen was dismayed to see that in order to get to the front door, she would have to cross a yard filled with the restless horses of the Hessian officers and the grooms who took care of them. She stood at the fence and tried to summon enough courage to walk to the door to ask when the next stagecoach would leave for Elizabethtown, but nothing in the world would induce her to go inside where the Hessians were. Since there was no sign of a stagecoach in the yard, nor anyone there she could ask, Ellen slipped quietly along the street beside the inn, where she spoke to the only person who wasn't a soldier. He was an old man who was unloading firewood from his cart near the small tap-room door of the inn. His boots were bundles of straw tied around his legs with ropes, and his hat had once been an animal of some kind. But it was hard to tell what sort now. The tail, which must have been bushy at one time, was worn to a scraggly rope. "Can you tell me where the stagecoach starts?" she asked. The old man turned around. He looked thin and tired, and his face was so gnarled it seemed to be made from a dried apple. Little bunches of gray hairs grew from his ears. He sucked in his wrinkled lips and squinted at her with sharp, beady eyes. "If you wait for a stagecoach," he said sourly, "you'll wait till doomsday." "Why?" Ellen asked anxiously. The man slammed 4 logs down on the ground before he spoke. "Because there ain't none." "None at all?" Ellen cried. "The British took them. Only officers ride in the stage now. No common people." The man angrily yanked more chunks of wood from his cart and swore at his old horse. "But how can I get to Elizabethtown?" "You can't." He loaded the firewood on his shoulders and shuffled on bowed legs to the tap-room door. It slammed behind him. Ellen's heart fell to the soles of her feet. Her legs would no longer hold her up as she sank down on a bench under the gnarled old tree beside the door. She sat so stiff and straight she seemed to be carved from a piece of wood. Except her twisting hands, she felt like a fly in a spider's web. She couldn't go to find the Shannons, and she couldn't go back home. There was no way home now. She wouldn't even think of it. If only the noise would stop so she could think. There was so much shouting and playing of fifes and bagpipes it made her head whirl as fast as her mother's spinning wheel. Why had Grandfather thought she could do this? Why had he sent her across the bay to a place she knew nothing about, with no way to get back home again? Why had he thought a 10-year-old girl could do a man's work? She stared at the company of Highlanders marching by in their plaid kilts and their bare knees, but she hardly saw them. Her thoughts raced around and around like squirrels. When the old man came back, Ellen saw that someone had given him a chunk of black bread. He was gnawing it with his gums and gulping it down as if he were starved. He must be very poor to be so hungry. She jumped to her feet. "Why, I could pay him to take me in this cart." She was so excited the words tumbled out. "Look, I'll pay you more if you'll take me to Elizabethtown." He snatched the coins from her pocket and held out her hand. She snatched the coins. "Here, I'll pay you all of them." The old man looked greedily at the coins in her outstretched hand. His fingers twitched as he reached for them. But at the last moment, he put his hand behind his back and shook his head. "Nope," he said firmly. "But why not?" cried Ellen. "Elizabeth's north. I go west to go home. Hardly get there before dark as it is." Her hopes fell to her feet like a china cup breaking in 100 pieces. "I suppose I could walk," she said forlornly. But she knew she never could do that. Not 10 miles all alone. When she had walked 10 miles before, she and Mother had kept each other company and given each other strength. "Can't walk on that road," cried the man. "That's a right busy road, out past the soldiers' camp. Lots of redcoats on horses. They'd run you down." So there's a little picture. So that's the scraggly old man and Ellen offering him money to take her on his coach. I guess that's probably that one back there. Ellen remembered the officers on horses in New York. She was sure they'd run down anyone who got in their way. Perhaps, she said stubbornly, some woodcutter who goes north would give me a ride. Small chance of that, the man snorted angrily. Nobody picks up strangers in these times. He spat at the tree and wiped his mouth with a thin claw of a hand. Too risky to pick up strangers who might rob or even kill you. Don't you know there's a war on, boy? All right, I'm going to stop there. I'll finish this for Monday, this chapter. But I want you to tell me in Flipgrid, so use my link that I have in the assignments page, and I want you to tell me, what do you think will happen? Will Ellen get to Elizabethtown? Will she have to walk? Will somebody give her a ride? So I want to know what your prediction is. Is she going to get this bread to Mr. Shannon to deliver to George Washington? All right, so I want to know your prediction. Sound good? All right, guys. I'll see you. I'll talk to you in a little bit. Bye.